Hello, welcome to the Martech Alliance Marketing and Technology Book Club. I'm your host, Carlos Doughty, and also the founder of the Martech Alliance. Today, I am chatting with Roland Smart about his fantastic book, The Agile Marketer, turning customer experience into your competitive advantage. Do you mind giving us a little bit of background for any of our listeners that possibly are not familiar with yourself?
Sure. So I spent a good part of my early career in the startup world. One of those startups was acquired by Oracle. I spent the last 6 years in the corporate marketing group at Oracle, helping drive a set of modernization initiatives. And I'm actually just about to get back to the startup world. I'm joining a company called Pantheon. I'm really excited about the company because their technology enables marketers to operate in a more agile fashion. So we can get into that in the conversation.
Okay, so let's jump straight into your book. For possibly anybody that hasn't yet picked up a copy, it'd be great if you wouldn't mind trying to give us kind of a really crunchy, succinct overview.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. So the book is really an introduction to what agile marketing is, where it came from, why it's a competitive advantage. And towards the end of the book, I dig into more how it can be applied to something like customer experience, and how customer experience is really going to be the battleground on which we're competing more and more in the future, and how Agile is really a facilitator of a culture that is designed to be able to compete on the basis of experience. So that's the book in a nutshell.
And I've got to ask, I always like to know, and rarely do people get a chance to rewrite the same book, but if you were redoing it right here today, is there a new chapter that you'd look to include?
Agile is really evolving pretty quickly in the way that it's being applied in the marketing world. And built into Agile is this concept of adaptation. To make Agile work in the context of the marketing function, we really need to adapt it to the function. But that is also a moving target. So since I published the book, I have learned a lot about what is working and what is not working. So I don't know that I would add a new chapter so much as I would probably write a second edition or a updated version of what is already there based on what I've learned from the many marketers that I've talked to on the podcast that I host, which is called the Marketing Agility Podcast, and talked with through my work as a consultant. I do some consulting on the side. I've worked with a few Oracle customers and a few other customers just to mostly help their executive teams understand Agile and understand what's involved in starting the process of Agile transformation.
And I think that's a really interesting point. So when you talk about working with the executive teams, you've obviously talked a lot about one of the critical things on a checklist for really getting agile adoption is, I suppose, that change management piece. What would you sort of recommend for somebody possibly in enterprise with a more traditional management framework? Obviously, in a startup, it's fair to say that adoption is easier to implement, broadly speaking. But what would you specifically around kind of driving that adoption from executive level down?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is, based on my research, it's pretty clear that executive buy-in is the single biggest predictor of whether or not there will be an organizational transformation that succeeds. You absolutely have to have executive buy-in. So that's the first thing. And buy-in means, not just that the executive is going to invest in it, but the executive needs to be prepared to actually embrace the process and participate in the process. I think the most clear representation of that is that the executives need to embrace some, what I think of as a mindset changes associated with adopting Agile. I can give you, there are many mindset changes that I think are required. I'll give you just an example of one change that I think is challenging for executives to get. So, Agile is really what I would describe as an empowerment model for small cross-functional teams. It really flips the traditional command and control structure, which is, centralized decision-making process based on extensive analysis, develop a waterfall plan, push it down into the organization. That's the traditional model. And we are moving towards a model where the decisions that we're making are not based on historical data that we're doing analysis on. They're much more based on real-time data, what's happening on the ground, what is that team engaging with right now, It's a distributed decision-making process where the small cross-functional teams are empowered to make decisions based on what's happening on the ground right now. And that model is much more flexible. There's a lot of advantages to that model that ultimately lead a lot of strategy and insight actually to be driven up from the bottom into the company. That's not to say that there's not an important role to play for input and strategy. It's just that the balance is going to change. And it really kind of flips this traditional top-down model where a significant amount of insight is really coming up from the bottom. So I sometimes tell a quick analogy about this where the traditional model is kind of like the stoplight, a traditional intersection stoplight where, the stoplight is driven by this program which is based on historical traffic patterns, right? We know exactly how it's going to work. It's highly predictable. The problem is that when you have unanticipated traffic flows, those stoplights really just fall down. This is why traffic jams are caused, because they can't in real time respond to changes in traffic. Whereas the roundabout is much more like Agile model, where the drivers who are in their cars, they're the ones making the decisions based on what's happening in the roundabout right now. And, roundabouts are much more flexible. They actually have greater throughput than a traditional stoplight. And the thing is, it puts much more work on the shoulders of the small cross-functional team, or in this case, in the example I'm sharing, the driver of the car. Yeah, it's worth it because these things outperform.
Fantastic. You were at the Martech conference, you talked about kind of a really practical checklist for somebody looking to implement Agile from ground zero. What else would you say kind of in your sort of top 5 or 6 key things that people should be thinking about? Obviously, we've got executive buy-in, but what else would you recommend?
Yeah, so I don't know if you want to continue your focus on, larger enterprises, but if we were, I would say that, it can be helpful to have some consulting come in to work with the executive team to not just understand what Agile is, but for larger companies in particular, to really structure the way that Agile will be rolled out or scaled into the organization. That is something which there is a good bit of complexity to it. I think that that is an area where there are less case studies and there's less of kind of a dominant design in the marketplace. So I think consulting can play a role. Likewise, I think for larger companies, training and certification has an important role in, for all those small cross-functional teams of people who are actually close to the work, quickly onboarding them with an Agile method and giving them the background in Agile is helpful because, it is a new way of working. Behavior change is really hard. Helping them understand the history and the broader context of Agile methods it's just a way of accelerating and increasing the likelihood of success. Following on that, I think selecting a method, and I always recommend that marketers start with a less prescriptive method. So, if you think about Kanban, Scrum, they sit on a spectrum of Kanban, less prescriptive, basically just means fewer practices to embrace, something like XP, right, which is designed for software development teams, much more prescriptive, lots of practices to follow, right? It's too much overhead, way, way too much overhead for marketing teams to take on. Even like a web team, which is largely a technical team, I recommend start with something like Kanban. Interesting, I think it's just worth noting that Kanban technically comes out of the Lean tradition, but there's a convergence that's happening in the marketplace between Agile and Lean, right? For your listeners, so that they're not confused, when I say Kanban, I'm still talking within the domain of what I think of as Agile marketing, or what is broadly defined as Agile marketing. So method selection and starting with a less prescriptive method is, I think, very important. I think I recommend that companies don't try and reorganize necessarily out of the gate into small cross-functional teams. I think the superpower of Agile is the small cross-functional team, but a lot of larger organizations have pretty calcified organizational silos, and asking them to step away from the silos or break up those silos and reorganize to get into Agile and to start getting value from Agile that's a non-starter, to be frank, for many organizations. So what I see is that companies oftentimes are setting small cross-functional virtual teams up where they're saying, hey, here's the small cross team. The members of that team are part of organizational silos, but we're going to carve out 2 days a week where they get to be dedicated on a small cross-functional team. And that is a good way for large companies to start putting their feet in the water, so to speak, and getting some experience under their belt. And what they oftentimes see is that those teams start outrunning their counterparts. And so then you get into the more sort of complicated challenge of, okay, now that we've seen the value, how do we start reorganizing to get more teams working in this way? But that's not the initial adoption. That's a little bit further down the path.
Thank you. Have you got any other interesting projects in the making?
I really see going to Pantheon as kind of, for me, kind of hitting two birds with one stone. I mean, I'm excited, obviously, to get back to the startup world and to build a team that can really lead as an example for other companies. Already, the marketing function there is already very sophisticated, and they've already embraced Agile, and they're doing great work. I'm really with them and helping them extend their practice even further. But the other piece is just, I'm really excited to drive awareness and adoption of the service, because I think it will dramatically improve a marketer's ability to operate in an agile fashion. So I think just having the technology will sort of facilitate this transformation and will allow Agile to get more traction in the marketing community. So I'm really excited about advancing that good bit.
And just on that point about joining sort of the startup life again, and not specific to Oracle, but just in general, what from the sort of corporate life will you not be sad to see left behind?
You know, it's going to be a very different, I think, environment. I think most of my time and energy at Oracle was focused on what I would describe as modernization initiatives, which was about taking a very traditional function and basically modernizing the technology the marketers were using, and then getting them to operate in a different way to take advantage of that technology. So a lot of it was kind of untangling legacy systems and bringing them up to current date. I think that work is very rewarding, and I feel like I was able to make a significant impact at Oracle. But to be honest, I'm even more excited about working with a team that it's not about coming up to the status quo. It's about, we've got a great practice. Let's really push the envelope of what's possible and demonstrate the incredible value that teams can deliver when they're embracing Agile. So I'm looking forward to kind of getting into this space where we can move much more quickly and we can really fully embrace Agile. You know, what we were doing inside of Oracle was more the enterprise case study, where I did have a small cross-functional team, a dedicated small cross-functional team, but we were amidst organizational silos and had to integrate with those organizational silos. We'll be more of a true holistic scenario at Pantheon. Working in that context is going to be really, really exciting.
It sounds like it. Fantastic. Roland, thank you so much for your time. I massively, massively appreciate it. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. And I'm sure our listeners will feel exactly the same. For anybody that doesn't already have a copy of the Agile Marketer, you should pick one up. It's absolutely fantastic. And Roland, just one final thing. If ever we can help with anything you're doing at all, you need only ask. I'd love to support with anything you're doing. Really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Enjoyed the conversation.